Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Johnson. Chris is the director of the Center for Servant Leadership at Gustavus Adolphus College. And he's going to share with us what a recent Lilly Grant project has uncovered about how students see themselves as agents of change in a world in need, and how that might transform the community and the church. Ambitious project. Thank you, Chris.
Does that help? Okay, wonderful. I get a little sweaty around technology. I appreciate that, Harlan. Thank you. And thanks so much for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here. I was telling Harlan, I've had the honor to come to know Steve Ronigan from Zumbro. Each of the last 2 falls, he has been part of a retreat that's called Exploring Your Life's Calling in a Time of Transition. That is a retreat that we've piloted a couple times over here in and around Rochester. Each of the last falls, growing out of a project called Vocation for Life, which is an initiative that flows out of the work of several of the ELCA colleges, not just Gustavus, where I'm from, but also Augsburg and Concordia and Luther and so on. You can list your favorite Lutheran colleges, and probably they're part of it. Since many of us in that project have been working, as Harlan mentioned, with the Eli Lilly Foundation grant project over the last decade and more, one of the things that we have recognized right away was that exploring your life's calling, having a sense of who you are and who the world needs you to be, is a lifelong project. It's not just something that 18 to 22-year-olds in college are engaged in. I'm seeing some nods around the room. So that was the occasion that allowed me to meet Steve, and then Steve passed word along to Shelley, and hence came the invitation to be with you today. So I appreciate that very much. Just a little bit of background about this, the context from which the kinds of things I'll be sharing with you today emerge. As I mentioned, the Lilly Endowment launched projects turned out to be 88 colleges and universities around the country, all church-related, liberal arts colleges. Their project was called Programs in the Theological Exploration of Vocation. Each of the 88 colleges received a $2 million grant, so you can just do some math. They spent a lot of money around the country trying to infuse into undergraduate education in this country more intentional attention to questions of vocation, calling. Gustavus was one of the first 20 of those 88 to launch a program, campus-wide initiative that since the fall of 2000 has been, has been engaging everybody on our campus to at least attend to the invitation to think about one's whole life as a vocation or calling, to connect who you really are, your gifts and talents, skills, passions, with the world's deep hunger. And since those projects began back in 2000, 2001, Lilly funded 88 of them. Now Lilly funding is gone, but there's been enough traction that many more colleges around the country, church-related and otherwise, are recognizing the power and importance of engaging young adults, emerging adults, in, again, this intentionality around thinking of their lives as a contribution to the world, as a calling. So now we're up to, there's a network, a national network of almost 200 colleges and universities doing this kind of work. And that's the kind of context nationally out of which some of the things that I'll be sharing with you today grow. I was telling Harlan and Shelley earlier, in my teaching and workshop leading and retreat leading at Gustavus and other settings, I try to resist being a talking head. So please, at any point throughout our time together this morning, if you have a question, go ahead and and let me know that. Throw something at me if you need to. A donut would be nice. But I'll respond if you throw anything at me. And I'll also try to pause several times and launch a question or something for you to consider. Some of it may be talk with your neighbor. Some of it might be, let's see if we can get conversation going in the whole room. But try to help me to not be just jabbering at you for the whole morning, okay? So one of the things that has been important at Gustavus as we've lived into this vocation work over the last decade and more, and at many other colleges around the country, has been to start with, why is it important? Why are we bothering at all? Why did Lilly think that this was an important enough need in higher education, in our country more broadly speaking, such that they decided to invest the kind of money that they did? At Gustavus, one of the ways that we've talked about it has to do with this kind of image. Some of you know the work of Ellen Goodman. She was a columnist for the Boston Globe and a syndicated writer. Ellen Goodman wrote, around the time that these grants were being launched, at least that's when I first found the quote, she wrote that normal life in this culture, in our society, normal life in 21st century Western American culture is getting dressed in clothes you buy for work, driving through traffic in a car you're still paying for in order to get to the job you need, so you can pay for the car and the clothes and the house you leave empty all day in order to afford to live in it. So with that sort of description of normal life in mind, and of course there are variations on that description, this is an image that came to me. And this is an image that describes the life of a typical college student, or administrator, faculty member, a parent, so on and so on. Being on the treadmill, one way or another. We live in a society that tells us to go faster and faster and faster. For the sake of what? Well, we often don't know. Again, societal messages tell us that it tends to be that we go faster and faster and faster to work harder and harder and harder in order to accumulate more and more stuff. Here's a little thing to throw into the next party conversation you might have, or dinner table conversation. We spend more money in this country every year for trash bags than 90 of the world's countries spend on everything, including healthcare and education and food and so on. So, normal life, faster and faster, more and more, without a sense of why. Or underneath all that, without a sense of who am I, really, who is on one kind of treadmill or another. And of course, being on the treadmill of one kind or another too often leads to feeling like this. By the end of the day, by the end of a work week, by the end of a career, normal life, as I'm caricaturizing it, of course, in this society, too often leads to feelings of rust out, burnout, meltdown, pick your metaphor, an emptiness, a hollowness, a sense of meaninglessness. I should put in the caveat here that good Lutherans, as we are, there's also a version of being on the treadmill that is all about living a noble life of purpose and contribution and service and so on. But that also can be just as destructive in different ways. You might know that there's all sorts of meaning packed into the life of service that you're trying to live, but you can also run yourself into the ground. So just that little nuance is important. We live in a world of all sorts of messages that tell us, well, what's important. Calvin and Hobbes are indispensable teaching tools. If it's a little bit dim in the back, it says, it's hard to know what's important in life. we don't notice the small stuff and we're never prepared for the big stuff. What about the stuff in between? That stuff's boring. Well, let's hope that bumbling along without a clue is important. And then the final words, well, according to the ads, fresh breath and dry armpits are crucial. One of the little bumper sticker taglines, so to speak, that we have used over the years in our vocation work at Gustavus is, sort through the voices that tell you who to be. That's a little bit of a play on some of you may recognize the word, the relationship between the word vocation and voice. Vocation in English comes from vocare in Latin, which means invitation, calling, summons, but Latin vox, V-O-X, is the English word voice. So living into one's vocation is a matter of finding one's voice. And this, Calvin and Hobbes points to that observation that there are literally thousands of voices every day telling us who to be, what to care for, what to spend our time on, what to spend our money on, so on and so on. A colleague of mine back at Gustavus, Bruce Johnson, who teaches in the Econ and Management Department, stopped me on the sidewalk one day as we were passing. A couple of years ago now, was at the beginning of a new school year, and he said, you'll need to know this, Chris. I said, I just came across a study, or one came across his desk, a study that was done that shows that the average 18 to 30-year-old, so people who are in what sociologists are now calling emerging adulthood, 18 to 30 years old, the average 18 to 30-year-old encounters between 3,000 and 5,000 commercial messages a day. And commercial messages could include everything from the kinds of logos on apparel. My little G button here, my Gustavus button, this would count as a commercial message. But yeah, just think of billboards, TV, media of all kinds. 3,000 to 5,000 voices telling us who to be. So again, sort through the voices that tell you who to be is one of the things that we have found to be really important in engaging young people in trying to be more intentional about living a life that is an alternative to the treadmill normal. Is this ringing a bell? It's getting a little scary how a typical college crowd doesn't recognize this. But we all know that's Jake and Elwood Blues, and some of you remember the movie, The Blues Brothers, well enough to know that this is a scene where, near the beginning of the movie, where the clouds part and the beam from heaven comes through the stained glass window in the church, and from here on out, they tell each other, we're on a mission from God. And you can see at the top there, it says, knowing your calling isn't always quite as easy as this. So this is another thing that we have found to be really important in working with the young people that we do at Gustavus. And of course, I'm drawing from my experience mostly at Gustavus in what I'm sharing with you today. I think, though, that I could safely generalize to typical college students pretty much anywhere, certainly within the colleges that have been doing this vocation work. So the first thing, again, a starting point is helping these folks and all the rest of us, no matter where we are in our life journey at Gustavus, helping all of us to conceive that there is more to life than just being on the treadmill. And I think a lot of people, certainly young people, are really hungry to know that and to catch a glimpse that there can be more to life than simply dragging yourself to classes in a major that your parents have told you to get so that you can be sure to graduate with credentials that will lead to a high-paying job so you can buy a lot of stuff which you'll then throw away in those trash bags. They want more than that. At the same time, again, we all live in a society that tells them that that is, in fact, the point of life. So while they hunger for that, they also then hunger for Well, instant answers. We live in a society of instant gratification and easy answers. So when they think of calling, this is one of the sort of, well, misconceptions that again we need to acknowledge as a starting point. That many young people, as used as they are to being able to turn everything into a commodity, including their happiness and their future, they like to think that for the size of the tuition check that I or my parents are writing every year, I certainly should be handed my life calling when I walk across the stage at graduation. Or somehow, the clouds should part and the voice of God should zap me in the form of a lightning bolt or sunbeams streaming through a church. Doesn't work that way. So that's another one of the starting points. I'm recognizing I'm talking a lot. Yes, thank you.
So I like that you brought that up, because I think there is this tendency to expect that, the clouds will part and someone will tell you who you're supposed to be.
Yes.
And if there's no voice doing that, then what gets substituted is the social, consumer-driven voices.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the idea, like the book Mary Catherine Bateson wrote, Composing
a Life, right.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You want to keep going with that idea,
Well,
composing a life?
as something to tell, as something to tell young people that it's not that you're going to get called, there'll be a calling, but it's not external. And some of that is opening your ears up and your eyes up and putting yourself in situations where you reflect on how am I interacting with this, how do I feel about this,
Yeah.
and keep working at it. And sometimes you've just got to structure something and go for it.
Yeah. Right.
And see how it works out.
Right. I don't know if you all heard that, but the reflection here was about the importance of listening. To not put words in your mouth, but to sort of reframe a little bit. The importance of, in fact, listening, of being able to turn down the volume on the monkey mind, the chattering, all those voices coming at you, and to be really able to hone in on the ones that are going to be life-giving and are going to speak truth about your life, who you are, who you're becoming. Did I get that?
And that you also may have to create some of your own voice, I guess.
And that you also may have to create some of your own voice. Yes. One of the really important resources that we've used over the years is a book by a fellow named Parker Palmer. Some of you may know his things. The book is called Let Your Life Speak. Subtitle is Listening for the Voice of Vocation. He talks about the importance of attending to the birthright gifts that have been woven into our being since the moment we arrived on the planet, and sort of rediscovering the truths of who we've been created to be all along. Thank you for that. Other reflections or questions so far?
Well, when you were saying too, like about the 18 to 30-year-olds and being driven to be that successful in commercial type of thing,
Yes.
we've noticed, at least in one of our sons, for sure though, that he took it completely the opposite way, and then did everything volunteer, and that there still should be a balance. Not that you put material things as your top priority, but also just to do some of the things like have insurance and, and I think, we struggle as parents. We didn't tell the kid what majors to have or anything like that, tried to help them find their own way. But this generation, I think, they see, because of the business part, that it's wasteful, and that sometimes I don't know that they see that some security in that is also important, or to be able to give through your work in that too, that it doesn't have to be all bad.
Good, good, thank you. Any other thoughts, questions at this point?
I have one other comment,
Sure.
which I thought, when you were talking about the consumerism, I heard a woman from Lutheran Social Services in Illinois was talking about a program they had to take children to spend time with their mothers who were imprisoned for drug offenses who were several hundred miles from their homes, and there was no assistance with keeping those family relationships intact. And one of the things that this woman commented as she discussed their volunteer efforts was, this society has no use for your child except as a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, my daughter was maybe 2 years old, and I thought about that, and it is so true. If you have no money, you don't exist. I mean, it's all about getting and selling.
The few slides that follow now try to capture some of the ways in which we engage our folks at Gustavus. Again, the students, but also the rest of us. One of the places we start with is to, again drawing on Parker Palmer. Another of his books is called The Courage to Teach, Exploring the Inner Landscapes of a Teacher's Life. It could be the courage to parent, the courage to doctor, the courage to accountant, the courage to fill in the blank. But he says, with regard to teaching, since that's the focus of the book, he says the best, most effective teaching is not primarily a matter of technique or strategy, the visible what of teaching. Rather, the best, most effective teaching flows from the identity and integrity of the teacher. It flows from the who is the teacher. So when we engage with folks at Gustavus and across the country in these questions of vocation, we're really talking about that identity, that integrity. Questions of meaning, of values, of knowing yourself well enough to know there's another slide coming up here that Frederick Buechner, poet, essayist, theologian, pastor, has written perhaps the best or most easily recognized short definition of vocation. That place where your heart's gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So the who part, the depth thinking that goes into vocation, just being aware of the who has to do with those things that go into heart's gladness. Yeah, here's Buechner right here. The kinds of things that would cause you to glow from within, that cause you to want to get up in the morning. Now, being a shy Minnesota Swedish Lutheran farmer's son myself, to talk about things like, what am I gifted at? What am I good at? That can be a stretch. Which is why life in community is so important. Because then, again, these are some of the voices that you do need to listen to, as the folks who know you well enough to be able to say, this is what you're really good at. You might not even, well, first it's hard to talk about giftedness, but gifts also, sort of by definition, are those kinds of things that flow from you with such ease and grace that you just don't even notice that you have it within you. So that's part of attending to that who that lies underneath the visible outward, the what, the techniques, the strategies, the actual motions you might go through in doing a particular job. Here's another set of language or ideas that we have used at Gustavus. This actually originated at Gustavus as well. It's developed with a colleague of mine, Daryl Jodock. Some of you maybe know him from different settings. Theologian, pastor. Drawing on the Lutheran tradition in particular, Daryl and I over the years have come to explain vocation this way, that it's a way really of understanding the self, what it is to be a person at all, in this four pieces intertwined kind of way. So first, again, gifted. That can be in that gifts and talents kind of way that I just mentioned. Also, theologically, you could think of it as graced. The sorts of truths that simply are true about ourselves because God has first said so. And has first set us free. Next one. God's gift to us of grace sets us free not only from things like the need to prove your worth by being on the treadmill, and earning not only a big paycheck just for the sake of it, but also earning God's forgiveness, God's approval. We are set free from that. And also free for lives of risk-taking, lives of contribution, lives of selflessness, that's a tricky word. Lives where your full self is so engaged in living out God's intentions for the good of the whole that you sort of get out of your own way. So set free from and free for. Ultimately also, as the illustration is meant to show, thinking of yourself in terms of or through the lenses of vocation is a way of recognizing that each of us always is fundamentally nested or connected, interrelated with realities that are greater than ourselves. We are not isolated individuals whose needs and gifts are completely removed from those of others or from the world around us and the other creatures with whom we share the world. So vocation has that sense of interrelatedness, interdependence, nestedness in realities bigger than ourselves. And finally, this last one, we wrestled with the language. I have up here mattering, a sense that your life in fact matters. Darrell the theologian will use words like agency or efficacy, words that point in the direction of simply an acknowledgement that the fact that I exist, the choices I make, the kinds of actions I take, in fact, do make a difference. Somehow, for somebody. This is a tricky one with young adults, maybe with all of us, but with young adults in particular. There's a little bit of an ambivalence or paradox among many of them. On the one hand, they are fairly, let's say, fairly politically engaged. Especially in recent election cycles, they've been voting at relatively high numbers. But when it comes to thinking about things like how they want to spend their consumer dollars, well, you know, they don't really give that much thought. And yet a vocational way of thinking about your whole life as a calling would raise that kind of question and would prompt each of us, not just young adults, but each of us to think about how does everything I do, every choice I make as a consumer, every conversation I have with a member of my community or my congregation, how it is that I show up in the world as a family member, as a neighbor. How do those things matter? This mattering thing is connected with the others, right? In that you're just going to have a sense of the impact of your life on others when you in fact are already thinking that your life is somehow intertwined with others. Darrell, one of the many gifts that he brings to this conversation is that one of his interests over the decades has been in seeking to understand Jewish-Christian relations and the history of the Holocaust. So I've heard him talk about different studies, attempts that have been made over time to try to understand what in the Holocaust have come to be known as the rescuers. So think about the film Schindler's List, for instance, a number of years ago now. Or the village in France, Les Chambon. Some of you maybe know the story about that village. There are different examples that can come to mind historically when trying to understand the ways that people living during the Holocaust were engaging with or reacting to the events as they were happening. On the one hand, of course, there are the perpetrators, the folks who did the Holocaust. And of course, there are the victims and the survivors to whom the Holocaust was done, so to speak. And then there are the bystanders. This was the vast majority of just average folks who felt like they could offer nothing, they could not make a difference, were afraid to try to make a difference, and who just went about their day-to-day lives trying to keep their heads down, out of trouble, go to work, and in doing so, they let it happen. The bystanders. And then there are the rescuers. And Darrell has pointed out that the studies that have been done over the years to try to understand what made the rescuers different from not only perpetrators, of course, but also the bystanders. What differentiated a rescuer from a bystander was, first, really hard to figure out because the rescuers often were so reluctant to speak about themselves. Again, the giftedness that they had was something that they had a hard time recognizing. Well, what's so special? We just did for others what we would have wanted them to do for us, for instance. But one way or another, the rescuers were rescuers because they had a sense that what they were choosing to do was going to make a difference, that it had the potential to, in fact, save innocent life. So really, and I'm recognizing I'm getting sort of heavy here, but in some ways, the vocation work with young people, with all of us across our lifespans, vocation work really is about challenging and equipping people to, when push comes to shove, live a life of a rescuer, rather than a bystander who's just on the treadmill doing my thing, and of course, heaven forbid, certainly rather than perpetrator. Time for me to stop again. Questions, comments? What are you hearing yourself say as you're trying to follow me along? Yes, thank you.
I'm used to thinking that when you get older, one of the values is that you stop worrying about vocation. As I listen to you today, we ought to be worrying about it forever. Is that correct?
I don't know that worrying is the verb that I would choose. Attending to it, paying attention to it, thinking about it. Yeah. Another insight that Darrell has reminded me of, given his work in Jewish-Christian relations, he's pointed to the fact that in the Hebrew or Jewish tradition, out of which, of course, one way or another we all flow in our faith, according to the Hebrew tradition, the human vocation is, the Hebrew phrase is tikkun olam, to heal the world. And I'm sure many of the world's wisdom and spiritual traditions have a similar sort of understanding that what it is to be human is, in fact, to carry with it some sort of calling that, yeah, is inescapable. You can ignore it, I suppose, or in other ways be distracted from living with integrity and authenticity into who it is that we've been created to be. But it's somehow just in the air and the water. And yes, for some folks, it can be a cause of great worry. And I may touch on that a little bit more as I go here. Other things, yes, way back. Thank you.
I have a friend whose home life is challenged in many different ways, and I was visiting with him just about a week ago. And one of the things that really is helping him through this very difficult time is getting out of the house and being in the midst of society. And as our conversation continued, one of the things I began to realize is that, you know, it's not so much maybe about finding out what our gifts are, but it's realizing that it's just, life is about being. It's about caring, like you have said, but it's about being a person that God has created you to be in relationship to other people, to communicate with them, not realizing what their situations might be, but that your words, your friendliness, your friendship can mean so much to someone who may be having a very difficult time. Someone who is up against challenges, someone who is looking for direction in life. They will come about that themselves as long as they know that they are accepted and that there's people around them that they rub shoulders with every day, whether it's in the elevator, in the hallway, at work, at school, on the street, wherever it might be. But it's just about being friendly and touching other people's hearts through that friendliness. One of the things that really puzzles me, I have visited many, many people at the hospitals and on the street, is that we go along walking like this, and we'll meet people in the hallway and we'll look like this. I don't understand that. It's about being, I think. Being the person that God has created you to be. Sharing your gift of friendliness.
Thank you. Brilliant. I should stop now. One of the, I see your hand, I'll just briefly offer here, one of the things that's really fun to watch, light bulbs go off over the heads of especially the students I work with when I offer this pithy little observation, not original to me, that we are human beings and not human doings. So thank you for that. Yes, next question.
Gustavus, class of 56, believe it or not.
Bad news.
How is this finding its way into the classroom, other than your lectures, other than your work with students? How is it finding its way into those students that might be having drug or alcohol problems, or having trouble in the classroom, or trouble with finances, and all these things? How is it getting into the student in various ways around the campus?
Thank you. Very practical, putting legs on this kind of question. Across the years at Gustavus, different colleges have done different things, but in general, at Gustavus, we've been trying to be very comprehensive about this. So the program that I came to Gustavus to launch was centered in an office called the Center for Vocational Reflection, mouthful, now the Center for Servant Leadership. We've been responsible over the decade and more for equipping people all across the campus to infuse it into the air and the water. That takes place through lots of off-campus retreats. And I'll say more in a little bit about why the kinds of programs that we have offered have bubbled up. So off-campus retreats, half day, overnight, weekend long. Lots of, as you mentioned, the classroom. We've done lots of faculty and staff development so that people teaching classes across the academic disciplines are equipped to infuse into the classroom experience what we call the big questions of identity, purpose, meaning, calling, values, and so on. So it is in the curriculum, permeating all the academic experiences that students will encounter over their 4 years. We work with the student life side of Gustavus so that it gets into residence halls and into athletic teams and student organizations. We do lots of bringing to campus, sort of launching campus-wide conversations, often spurred by bringing guest speakers, artists, musicians, scholars, authors, people like Parker Palmer and so on. So we hope that across the 4 years, the cumulative effect of all the different kinds of things I mentioned, workshops, we commissioned an original world premiere play that had a couple weekend run in connection with one of our Nobel conferences a few years ago. So a wide array of things, the cumulative effect of which is that it gets everywhere. The invitation gets everywhere. Now, we can't, so far, Gustavus anyway, has chosen not to require of students any one of the kinds of things I've mentioned. Augsburg College's version of the vocation program, they did develop I think it was a first-year religion course that every student was required to take. That included a special attention to vocation. Gustavus's faculty did not want to try to fit everybody into the same box. So instead we created the wider array of things with the hope that the kind of things that we might offer would include a wide enough variety of invitations, openings, possibilities, so that at least seeds can get planted across these 4 years. That's another thing I could mention here, is that not every 18 to 22-year-old or 42-year-old or 62-year-old or 82-year-old is ready in the ways that that might be the most helpful. To be able to engage in the sort of intentional thinking of your life in this way that we might want. So a lot of what we've done at Gustavus is seed planting, cultivating the soil, trying to enrich it as much as we can, so that maybe a typical Gustavus grad does need, in some ways, to get the credentialing, get the major, get the credentialing, get the diploma, get out there in the world, figure out how to pay for insurance, how to navigate a boss you don't like, and then 3, 4, 5, 15 years down the road, okay, now I get it. Now I see what they meant way back then about heart's deep gladness, world's deep hunger, so on and so on. So over the years, increasingly more of our work has been around working with alumni to help them to continue to return to the questions or engage with the questions for the first time if they weren't inclined to do so as students. Am I answering your question about how? Great, thank you. More voice here.
Over the years you have been doing this, now do you have any evaluative process or any outcome studies?
Across the system, or across the umbrella programs, across the many colleges and universities, there have been some attempts to do that. We have been more oriented on program by program at Gustavus. So one of them, for instance, that I should mention here in terms of readiness, across the many colleges and universities, right from the beginning, back when these programs were first being launched, an important observation had to do with gender dynamics, and that far, far, far more women than men were likely to be engaged in the kinds of programs we were offering. That was true at Gustavus, that was true pretty much across the board. So the question became, where are the men? A characterized way of describing that would be something like, male college students are more likely to be playing their video games and drinking, frankly, than wanting to go on a retreat or take part in a community service project or take part in religious life on campus. So there's been a lot of evaluation, study, assessment done about how to better engage the men, and we're finding, this is just a microcosm now, but we're finding that the kinds of opportunities that I mentioned before, if we can somehow figure out ways to hook men and get them in the door at all, then yes, evaluations are showing that they become, when they encounter the questions, when they encounter opportunities, what we call time, space, and permission to engage with questions about vocation and purpose and meaning, they are much more likely to say by the time they graduate that they are going to be looking for a job that connects heart's deep gladness and world's deep hunger, for instance. That students are more likely to come to see of themselves that they do have that quality of agency or mattering, that yes, I am going to make a difference. So in different ways, whether it's program by program by program, or targeting certain kinds of demographics, or in some of the other colleges looking at the cumulative effect over time, the results are promising. We also recognize that this is incredibly countercultural stuff. Asking people to make of their lives something different from what the popular culture says. So we have a lot of uphill work to do. Just in I don't have numbers right in my head right at the moment, but there is every year, pretty much every incoming college student in the country, so hundreds of thousands of students a year, take part in what's called the CIRP survey, CIRP. I don't remember what it stands for. It's a survey that's implemented at every college campus across the country by a research outfit out in California. It has been since the early 60s, I believe, so there's lots of decades of accumulated data now. One of the things that we've noticed was that for the first couple of decades, when asked the question, what do you hope that a major outcome will be of going to college at all? What are you expecting will be the case in your life? From the beginning of the survey up till about the mid-'80s, one of the top answers was, I hope or expect to come out of college having developed a meaningful philosophy of life. And one of the lowest rated answers was, I hope to come out of college with the credentialing that will help me to get a high-paying job. And starting around in the mid-'80s, those lines crossed. And that's still the case. Even with a decade of this vocation work happening, right? It's still the case that now, far more students are saying, I hope or expect to graduate from college with credentialing to get a high-paying job, and far fewer are saying, I hope to graduate with a meaningful philosophy of life. On some individual campuses, and I can't say that we've done the kind of assessment at Gustavus to be able to claim this, but I want to say that at some of the campuses, or cumulatively across the decade of these vocation programs across the country, there has been a little bit of movement in those two lines. We have not changed the culture yet, but we're working on it. I need to jump ahead as I'm seeing the clock tick. Very quickly, just a couple other ways that we try to bring this down to earth from the thinking of yourself as nested and connected and free and gifted and mattering and all. That's kind of heady. So on the ground, here are a couple different ways that we talk about vocation. Daryl's colleague I mentioned before tells a story about how when a friend of his was from out east was moving. His family had to move after several decades in the same location. It was the hottest day of the summer. Things were not going well, but there was one fellow on the moving van crew who just was bounding around, had a couch strapped to his back, or the chest freezer, whatever it might have been, was bounding around the whole day long, in and out of the house, in and out of the truck. And finally, at the end of the day, as they were all packed up and ready to close the doors, Daryl's friend asked the mover, how did you do that? I sense that this work is more than just job for you. And the furniture mover's quick paraphrased response was something like, well, yeah, my job is furniture mover, and I get my paycheck, and that's fine, and it helps me to put food on my family's table. But really, I recognize that moving can be one of the most stressful experiences in a family's life together. So really the way that you see me doing my work has to do with my calling in life. He did not use this language, okay? He did not use the language of calling, but what he was saying was, my job is furniture mover, but my calling is to help people to navigate a stressful time as gracefully as possible. And that brings me huge joy. So vocation in some ways is really about how you show up in whatever the roles, responsibilities, work might be. Tent pole. Some of you have experienced kind of camping in tents where the poles now come in these segments that are all tied together with elastic cord. Vocation is a way of thinking of your life in terms of there might be different segments of your life, different jobs that you might have, different career paths, different roles, different relationships are the different segments. Vocation is the elastic cord that ties the whole thing together. and allows you to be able to dwell or inhabit, take shelter in that whole life, comprised of those different segments, each of which might change or can be interchangeable over time. And then the more familiar image that some of you maybe encountered before, vocation is the difference between slapping together a pile of bricks and doing the same work, but having a sense that what you're doing is building a cathedral. Again, it has to do with how it is that we show up in those. I'm just going to skip this one. The title of today's talk had something to do with servant leadership. So I was going to contrast how we try to engage students in thinking about their callings to offer themselves as in roles and acts of leadership over time, contrasted in a servant leadership model, contrasted with a more conventional, normal, yell louder theory of leadership. Mentoring community is something I wanted to touch on just very briefly. And that goes to some of what was asked before about how do we do this at Gustavus? Well, the how is nested in also the spirit with which we do it. And that is based on, in part on this, the work by this friend and scholar, mentor here, Sharon Parks. One of her books is called Big Questions, Worthy Dreams, in which she says that one of the kinds of things that's important in helping a young person to live into a life of vocation, a life understood as a calling, has to do with the contexts within which they are equipped to engage with big questions. These questions of identity, purpose, meaning. What am I here for? Beyond just being on the treadmill. So, with that idea in mind, this notion of mentoring community, she says that to equip somebody to live life in the world as it is now, having a mentor is good. Having someone with whom you can come to a fuller sense of self and so on. If we want to equip young people to live into the world as we wish it could be, to equip young people into the world as it could become, then a mentoring community is crucial. And that, by that she means not simply a collection of individual mentors, as important as that might be, but a community whose shared narratives, practices, ways of being together, collectively can guide and shape the lives of all of its members toward a vision of the common good. So one of the things that she points out is that the key question is, mentoring for the sake of what? The mafia can be understood as a mentoring community because they have a certain sort of goal in mind. A community like Zumbro can ask itself, how, for the sake of what, or toward what vision of the world do we want to be guiding, shaping, mentoring all of our members, and especially the lives of our young people? So how do we do that? What are some of the moments that add up to an ecology of mentoring for vocation here? What are some of the images, symbols, stories, songs, practices that can help people to come to a sense of themselves as nested, gifted, free, mattering? How do you ask a question like, whose voice is not heard? Who is not at the table? The one that talks about diversity here. Being open to as wide a range as possible. Welcoming gifts and talents of all. This mentoring community thing is a whole nother session that we don't have time for now. So swinging back then full circle and winding down. By the way, I'm happy to linger for a while if some of you want to continue the conversation. Instead of being and teaching, mentoring one another into just more treadmill, normal life, we can be intentional about helping each other to live lives that, Parker Palmer's language, reunite soul and role, true self with who we are and what we do in the world. Instead of being normal, we can in fact help each other to ask big questions. We can enlarge the capacities that are all within us somehow to lead lives of contribution to the flourishing of the whole. And ultimately, it's a matter of helping each other to get off that treadmill, because we recognize that the script that puts us on the treadmill, that social script, just is not adequate. It is not who we are called and equipped to be by the God who calls us daily through baptism to connect Sunday to Monday and soul and role for the sake of God's vision of good. That's where I need to stop, if only because the clock tells me so.
Will you read it? Read it. Read it.
Right at the beginning here it says, "Oh good, a true or false test. At last, some clarity. Every sentence is either pure, sweet truth, or a vile, contemptible lie. One or the other, nothing in between." And then at the very end, he just flips it on. So if you have true, false questions for me or any other kind, again, I'm happy to linger. It's obviously some of you need to head out. So let me first say thank you for the invitation, for engaging with each other as you have. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.